Do you know the difference between pleasure and happiness? And is there even a difference between pleasure and happiness? Well, your physiology responds differently to pleasure than it does to happiness. So let me just say what I mean by happiness. So happiness is essentially a sense, to me, it's a sense of feeling fulfilled. It's a sense of having meaning in your life and having some sort of purpose. And that leads to happiness. And happiness is a long-term kind of thing. It's more of a state than an emotion. And pleasure is something that we can experience while we're happy, on the road to happiness, but also actually while we're miserable. So why am I even talking about this? Well, because pleasure and happiness cause two different chemical reactions in our bodies. So two of our primary neurotransmitters are serotonin and dopamine. Dopamine is the reward chemical. Every time we do something that we get rewarded for, we produce dopamine. So when someone tells you how amazing you are, you get a dopamine hit. When you achieve a goal, you get a dopamine hit. Whether that goal is big or small, anything that gives you pleasure raises your dopamine. So when you buy a beautiful outfit, dopamine is produced. Serotonin, however, is a more long-term kind of chemical, shall we say, and serotonin is linked to happiness. So when you experience a sense of purpose, when you experience fulfillment, when you experience a certain joy in your life in general, then you produce serotonin. And when you experience pleasure, you produce dopamine. Now, the effects of serotonin are sort of long-term and sustained, whereas the effects of dopamine sort of spikes and drops. You know, we get a hit and then it drops. So what happens with dopamine is because its effect is not long-term, we keep on needing another hit, which means we keep on repeating whatever it is that gave us pleasure. So something like comfort eating can do this. So when we eat foods that we associate with pleasure and comfort, we produce dopamine, and then the dopamine drops and then we don't feel great, and so then we have to eat it again. And this is how we become quote unquote addicted to things. So it's the same with personality traits. When you do something that validates that you are strong and you get a dopamine hit from it, the dopamine drops and then you have to do something else that proves that you're strong so that you can get another dopamine hit. And this is what drives achievement. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that when you become addicted to the dopamine, then you start compulsively behaving in order to get the dopamine hit. Now, that can be taking drugs, that can be exercise, that can be work, that can be being strong, that can be being kind, that can be helping people. Any of those things that produce that short-term dopamine hit is what makes us addicted. And so what has happened in our consumerist society is that marketing, in fact, there is a term. So I'm listening to this book called The Myth of Normal by Dr. Gabor Mate. I'm listening to it because it is a long-ass book. Okay, I think it's got 600 pages in it. And I feel like I've been listening to it forever, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through. And The Myth of Normal really examines what it is that our society has defined as normal and how abnormal that actually is. And I am on the section now where we're talking about how our buying and our habits are controlled by marketing. And there is a term called neuromarketing. So what marketers and big corporations have done is they've hired neuroscientists so that they can actually use our neurochemistry to drive their marketing. And that's essentially what keeps us consuming and buying and trying to feel better. So we're trying to buy happiness by buying these little dopamine shots, as it were, and we're getting more and more and more addicted. And so as a result of that, long-term happiness eludes us. Now, the reason why this is really important to me is because this has effects on our health. And this brings me back to, in order for us to have happiness, in order for us to produce the proper, stable, optimal amounts of serotonin, we need a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. And we need to be aware that it's helpful to be aware when we are going for the dopamine hit or whether we're going for the long-term serotonin. And so pleasure is very often associated with instant gratification, and happiness is associated with long-term gratification. And it's very difficult to delay gratification when you have no meaning or purpose. I hope that made sense. Let me know in the comments if you agree, disagree, are indifferent. If you hate it, if you love it, I'd love to hear. Just observe yourself and ask yourself, is this dopamine? Was this serotonin? Or is this pleasure? Or is this happiness? Nothing wrong with pleasure, my friends. It's only when we become addicted to the short-term pleasure that we become disconnected from our long-term happiness. So I'd love to hear what you think.